All right, joining me now is Luke Harding. He is a journalist, a writer. He was a correspondent in Moscow around the time that I was a correspondent there. He works for the Guardian newspaper, and he's just written a great book called Shadow State. And he also wrote Collusion, Secret Meetings, Dirty Money, and How Russia Helped Donald Trump Win. Luke, thanks for talking. Any doubt in your mind that Donald Trump was pushed into office by the Kremlin?
No, that's the short answer. I think every single American intelligence agency has concluded that Russia, Vladimir Putin, helped Donald Trump win in 2016. He was very much Moscow's candidate. And Robert Mueller, the special prosecutor, said the same in his report last year, which actually I have a few problems with, but what was very clear was that Mueller talked about sweeping and systematic interference by Russia. And this was a kind of multi-level thing. There was traditional espionage, there were oligarch intermediaries who were buzzing all around the sort of Trump people. And of course, there was a huge social media campaign, which Mueller laid out, involving trolls, sort of professional Russian state bloggers sitting in St. Petersburg pretending to be real Americans when, of course, they weren't. But actually, the corollary of that is that operation was viewed in Moscow as a terrific success. And I've got no doubt that Putin and his kind of team of spies and hackers and sort of troll bots will be back, if they're not back already, in time for November to try and keep Trump in the White House.
Why?
Well, because I think they see him as a pretty damaging guy. I mean, we have to be sort of clear. Putin isn't responsible for all of America's woes. He's not responsible for the turmoil we've seen recently over Black Lives Matter, or for Trump's response to the coronavirus epidemic, or so on. But what he's very good at, in classic KGB style, is sort of sniffing out weakness, identifying cleavages and divisions of Western societies and trying to exploit them. And Trump is perfect for that, because to my mind, there's no doubt that America is much reduced on the international stage. It's more America alone than America first. And some of the long-held strategic goals of the KGB throughout the Cold War have come to pass. For example, the US now has pretty lousy relations with Germany, with France, with the European Union, which Trump seems to regard as a kind of enemy, while at the same time fawning over autocrats and despots. So
yeah, I mean, honestly, a lot of your book seems like a ridiculous, far-fetched fiction book. If we didn't already know that it's not, and that we are living a very strange reality right now.
I mean, Dana, that's so true, and I sort of almost sort of think, why write novels when our reality at the moment is so strange and disturbing and gruesome and containing shocking incidents. And I never planned to write 3, or I think I've done 4 books on Russia now, but it just so happens that Russia's sort of playing this outsized role in international affairs, which is disproportionate to its economy, small, or its real reach. But what it's very good at is it's good at sort of spying, and it's good at these kind of crude, clumsy, bold, we don't care if you catch us operations like the
Can I ask you about that? Because you obviously, the first part of the book is about Salisbury and the poisoning a nerve agent of Sergei Skripal, for people who don't remember. And he was a former GRU spy who then was given over, and in a prisoner swap, he was released from prison. He settled in the UK. Suddenly something bad was wiped on the door of his house, and he almost died along with his daughter. And you paint a picture of a spy service, which, by the way, the GRU is much bigger than the FSB. I mean, this is the one that sows discord, carries out assassinations in Europe. You paint a picture of a GRU that is not exactly, while notorious, is not very effective, and bungled that assassination attempt.
Well, that's right. I mean, I think you have to be sort of careful what tone you use when talking about the Skripal assassination, because
I thought you were going to tell me I better be careful about the tone I use when talking about the GRU.
well, I mean, Dana, that's to do with your own kind of personal risk assessment. But no, my point is merely that I mean, I compare the GRU, Russian military intelligence, to a sort of lethal but shambling golem. In other words, it's pretty dim, but if it's ginormous fist, if it comes down the street and it smashes your house, then that is a sort of terrible thing. And so certainly the GRU assassins, and we now know there's this top secret unit based in Moscow that's been doing a lot of this stuff.
What's it called?
It's got a rather unpromising name. It's unit, I think, 29155. And it's based at a building in northwest Moscow, and it's a sort of diversionary unit of, we think, maybe 15, 20, 25 officers who, like in the Cold War times, were sort of sent behind enemy lines, and they were hanging out in the French Alps, traveling to Switzerland, shadowing American ambassadors, going to Bulgaria to poison arms dealers. And two of these kind of assassins from this unit flew into Salisbury using fake Russian passports, which said their names were Petrov and Bashirov. And in fact, we now don't know that they were called Myshkin and Shapiga. And yeah, I mean,
seen very publicly on CCTV video that was released then by the Prime Minister Theresa May at the time.
Well, that's right. And there's a kind of, I mean, when you try and interpret what happened in Salisbury in spring of 2018, I mean, it's clear that they were not very good spies. And in fact, their target survived, and another woman, British woman, Dawn Sturgis, tragically died after picking this stuff up by accident. But at the same time, it is quite effective. I mean, they were carrying a nerve agent. It's the first time that nerve agent has been deployed in Europe since the Second World War in a civilian area. And I think ultimately the message of Salisbury from Moscow to London was a kind of gigantic V sign, a kind of up yours to the British government, to MI6, the British sort of spy service. But ultimately, I think what Salisbury was all about was reminding people inside Moscow that if they, by people I mean the Russian elite and people inside Russian security agencies, that if they blabbed to the Americans about 2016 and Trump, about Russia's secret operations, that the long hand of Moscow will catch them maybe some years later, and when they're not looking, it will smash them from behind. And it's a pretty chilling message, and I think quite an effective one.
A former very high-ranking intelligence official on the American side told me technically that doesn't necessarily break one of the unwritten rules, because Skripal was still considered to be one of theirs. But these bounties that were placed on American soldiers in Afghanistan, in intelligence that GRU was paying, cash to kill, that does absolutely cross over red lines in this unwritten code that they have. What would you comment on that?
Well, I mean, I think that's a really interesting question, Dana, but I also think that I'm not sure the rules are the rules anymore. I fear we may be in some kind of post-rules age. And in a way to understand what Russia and Vladimir Putin does, you have to try and figure out how Vladimir Putin thinks. And his thinking is absolutely KGB. It's zero sum. What's bad for the West is good for Russia. And America, as before, as in Soviet times, is the main enemy. And there's a kind of famous quote from Lenin, who said that Moscow's relations with the West were a state of partial war. That's how Putin sees it. He sees himself in a kind of semi-war with America, and Afghanistan is just an extension of that. And this is all grudge-driven. He remembers the Soviet humiliation in Afghanistan in the 1980s when the CIA, supplied the Mujahideen with Stinger missiles, and a lot of Soviet soldiers were killed. He thinks, in his conspiratorial way, that America is trying to remove him from power and interferes in Russia's internal affairs and so on. And it's this paranoia and sort of sense of victimhood which drives what Russia does internationally. And if they can outsource a murder operation to a few Taliban operatives, they will do that. That's what the GRU does.
So you believe it has the hallmarks of the GRU. It's believable intelligence, and you believe in the end. You keep saying Putin. You believe that Putin would have to approve something like that, or approve the Salisbury poisoning? Do you believe in both cases? Let's take Afghanistan first. Do you think that he would approve that?
Dan, I think that's right. I mean, it's not that Putin makes every single decision in the Russian Federation, big country, 148 million people, 12, 13 time zones. Of course not. But what you have to understand is that both inside the spy agencies and inside government, there is a sort of absolutely Soviet bureaucratic culture where if something difficult needs to be decided, the decision has to go to the top. And when you're talking about extraterritorial assassination of people like Skripal or Alexander Litvinenko killed with a radioactive cup of tea in London in 2006, or a bounty operation to try and rub out American soldiers in Afghanistan, then basically only Putin can authorize that, because if it goes wrong, no one will want to take responsibility. And you just, without being too macabre, you just look at the GRU, and they have a very high turnover of directors. I think the last 2 or maybe the last 3 have died very rapidly in mysterious circumstances.
You suggested that the head of the GRU, who was in charge during Salisbury, suddenly came down with an illness and passed away in, what was he, like 62, and that 60 something. And that feeling was by GRU members that, I mean, that was a message to everybody else. You bungle an operation and you're out. You're out forever.
I mean, the thing is, we have to be very careful. You know, we don't know for sure, but one of the people I interview in my book, Shadow State, is Viktor Suvorov, who himself worked for the GRU. He was a star military foreign intelligence guy based in Switzerland who defected back in 1978. And as far as I know, he's the only GRU person who will discuss this sort of secretly. And I talked to him about the death of Igor Korobov, he was called, died, as you say, at the age of 62. And Suvorov said, I said, look, you know, would he have been bumped off? And Suvorov said, well, you know, it's speculation on my part, but everybody inside the GRU will understand 125% that he was murdered. And he just said, they know the nature of this organization. In other words, it's a sort of brotherhood. It's a kind of secret fraternity, but it's also a place where if you mess up, there is no forgiveness.
You know, we talk about Salisbury, we talk about Afghanistan, those places are far away, but people don't realize that in your book, you also talk about the GRU hacking the DNC and then giving that to WikiLeaks. So, I mean, they've had direct impact on on Hillary Clinton's campaign. And again, it comes back to Trump being elected.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. I mean, the GRU are at the heart of this. We know there were 2 hacking teams, one from the FSB, which is primarily the domestic intelligence service in Russia, the other from GRU, which has a global mandate and traditionally did war and conflict and sabotage, but has got into hacking in the last decade. And certainly American intelligence have been tracking these hackers quite closely, so have the Brits. And actually, you just have to read the Mueller report to see what happened, which was GRU officers, technical people, based both at the main building in Moscow and at a kind of tower hired in early 2016, systematically hacked into the DNC with the results that we know. And they also set up this fake persona, Guccifer, that was interacting with very many American journalists and sort of leaking stuff to try and sabotage and blow up the vote. It was pretty effective. And I think what's interesting, I mean, we talked about the spies being rather incompetent, but one thing they're rather good at is that they understand America. They've learned English. Whoever was writing the lines for Guccifer sounded more or less like you do, Dana. I mean, you are
careful. I'm Canadian now. Don't go Canadian. Too far.
I'm so sorry. Okay, well,
I get it. No, yeah, they sound North American.
They sound North American in quite a plausible way. And when someone called out Guccifer and said, "You're a Russian spy," he wrote back, "Total fail!" Exclamation mark! Exclamation mark! Exclamation mark! And I guess my substantial point is there's a sort of cultural imbalance here. You know, America, North America. It's a language the world speaks and understands. It's a culture of Hollywood and movies that people get. Whereas actually Russia, to most people who haven't worked there or don't speak Russian, is a kind of mysterious faraway land. And this has been instrumentalized by Russian spy agencies to their advantage. And you might say that the US was really taken for a ride by foreigners it didn't understand 4 years ago.
We talk about the Steele dossier on Trump a little bit, and I'm surprised you went back to that because a lot of people have raised questions about it. This is a basic. He is a former British spy who put together a dossier with a number of different sources that you talk about at length in the book. Not who the sources are, but you talk about how solid his sources may be, and essentially the allegation is that there is compromise. There is. The Russians knew that Donald Trump did something in a hotel room with a couple of prostitutes, and that is one of the collars that they have on the highest office in the land in America right now. And in your book, you suggest that it's still considered, or at least Steele thinks, that it was never proven wrong despite Trump's denials, and it's still about 80 to 90% true.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, because Trump, as we know, is not a man with a great relationship with the truth, and because he denies something repeatedly and attacks whoever, that doesn't actually make something inaccurate.
So it wasn't discredited.
Well, so I haven't actually talked to anyone who knows Russia, who either lived there or worked there as you and I did as correspondents, or who work for. I've obviously talked to various people in foreign intelligence services who don't think that the FSB has a file on Donald Trump, which, if it's in paper form, is bigger than your house and my house put together. I mean, Trump first visited Soviet Moscow back in 1987, where there's no doubt the KGB spied on him, and there were discussions about building a Trump Tower and so on. And Czech intelligence was spying on him and his then wife, Czechoslovakia.
And we know, living in Russia, that's routine. If you are a foreigner, especially a high profile one like Donald Trump, or you're a journalist or you're a businessman, if you go to a hotel room or you go out somewhere, you are most likely going to be videotaped and recorded somewhere.
Yeah, and if you stay in the presidential suite of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Moscow, where President Obama stayed, and you are a very well-known American businessman, then everything will be recorded anyway. I mean, it's just what the FSB does. It's what the KGB did. Mm-hmm. And also, I know from personal experience. I mean, I spent 4 years in Moscow as a Guardian's correspondent from 2007 to 2011. And we had a series of really spooky, nasty break-ins by the FSB into our apartments, where they moved stuff around and they left stupid clues that anybody could find, open windows. And I talked to the British Embassy and I said, look, what's going on? And they said, well, confidentially, yeah, it's the FSB. They treat the Americans in the same way, diplomats, the Brits as well. Yeah. And I said,
when I was there, an American diplomat told me how on a regular basis he used to come home and there would be something left in the toilet, or there would be a cigarette burning in the ashtray, and the message being, we are on you, we are watching you all the time.
We're watching you all the time. And they said, look, your apartment is bugged. And I said, well, what about the bedroom? And they said, yeah, that's also bugged. And then I said, look, well, Her Majesty's government do something about this. And they said, sorry, old chap, have a cup of tea and a biscuit, because basically, first of all, I never worked for them. And secondly, it would be counterproductive because the FSB would break in again anyway and just reinstall the bugs. So if they bothered with you and your friends and me, imagine what they will do with people who've got real intelligence value like Trump. So ultimately, Trump says it's not true, but he's made multiple visits to Moscow. There'll be a very large file. There'll be a psychological profile of him, of his weaknesses, of what, and a readout of his phone calls and so on. And I mean, Trump can deny it, but it's there. It's
do you believe Steele? Do you believe the dossier?
I mean, with a few caveats, yeah. I mean, I don't think the dossier is immaculate. It was raw intelligence produced at speed, but I think the basic premise, the basic pillar that the Russians wanted Donald Trump to win and had been cultivating for some time is true. And I think the compromat there's definitely compromat, whether it's 2 prostitutes or 3 or something else. You know, I don't know, but it's the best explanation for why Trump behaves the way he does with Putin. And
doesn't it amaze you, if sorry to jump
Yeah.
in here though, but you have every meeting being recorded and constant surveillance, and yet when the 2 presidents meet, you have these tremendous gaps, and where President Trump went to great lengths that the meetings with Putin were not transcribed or recorded.
Yeah, and we also have the latest report from Carl Bernstein with CNN saying that his understanding is that Trump is unbelievably slavish, fawning before Putin whenever they speak on the phone, while at the same time being demeaning and pretty awful to Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, to Theresa May when she was British Prime Minister, and so on. And clearly, he doesn't want this out. And I suspect if we ever get to see the transcripts of their conversations, that actually it won't be Vladimir Putin saying, you know, Donald, do what we say, or we'll release the tape. It's Putin using silky KGB flattery, saying, Donald, I am your true friend. You're beset by enemies, by fake news, by the media, by people who hate you, but I recognize your greatness and I will stick loyally with you to the end. And this seems incredibly crude, but it seems to work with Trump. It seems to work with Trump. And actually, any self-respecting foreign dictator is able to manipulate him.
Page 301, I'm going to read your book now. Sorry, I'm stealing your book. Quid pro quo chapter. As Trump geared up for the 2020 election, his relationship with Putin was still not fully explained. Russia didn't invent Trump or the isolationist forces he represented, but it certainly encouraged him. That Putin had leverage of some kind over Trump seemed indisputable. So this isolationist force he represented, then you start building a bridge between what Putin did in America in the election and with Trump to the Brexit vote in Britain and the election victory of Boris Johnson, which was linked, you make the case.
Yeah, I mean, there were two major espionage operations in 2016. One was Trump, which we've talked about, and the other was actually supporting the Brexit side in the EU referendum that we had here. Now, it's pretty clear that especially after 2014 in the war in Ukraine, when the European Union imposed sanctions on Russia, that Putin was extremely keen to do anything that would damage the EU. So you know, Brexit was a kind of ideal vehicle for that. And as we've seen, it's a strange London from Paris and Berlin. It's reduced, diminished the UK. It's not great for our economy or international reputation and so on. And what I try and lay out in Shadow State are the interactions between Russian spies based at the Russian embassy in London and key people from the Leave EU campaign, such as Aaron Banks, Bristol businessman, his sidekick Andy Wigmore, and so on. And this is important because British politics is not the same sums of money as in North American politics. And Banks gave almost £9 million to the Leave campaign. It's the biggest nation in British political history. And there's been a big question mark about where he got that money from. Yeah. He has a Russian wife. We now know he visited the Russian ambassador on multiple occasions in the run-up to the vote. He was offered gold deals by a friendly Russian tycoon from Siberia, then a diamond deal, then another gold deal.
Okay, so you're not the first person to raise any of these question marks. I mean, you do it very eloquently, but there was an all-party investigation here. The report, as we speak, so people don't understand that this is some kind of historical loose end. I mean, this is an ongoing discussion in the UK about what influence the Russians may have had over the Brexit campaign. And that report has been locked up in number 10 Downing Street. Prime Minister Boris Johnson wants to keep it secret. Why?
Well, we don't entirely know because he basically stuffed the report down his sock. in October of last year. And as you say, it's kind of refused to publish it ever since. But I think I'm not expecting a kind of huge smoking gun, by the way, from this report, but I suspect it's a sort of serious and discursive document. It's about 50 pages long, apparently, with a secret annex, which lays out some of the ways in which Russia has tried to intervene in British politics.
And likely compromise Trump.
Well, yeah, and that's part of it, is that this is actually a story I kind of broke for The Guardian last week, but Christopher Steele was one of a group of expert witnesses invited to give evidence. And he produced a sort of 7-page strategic overview memo, which I've read. It's actually a very good document. One accusation he makes is that the British government of Theresa May, who was Prime Minister at the time, and Johnson, who was the British Foreign Secretary, were basically warned. They were told in late 2016 that the Russians most probably had leverage over Donald Trump. And instead of investigating or getting their best spies to try and chase this down and asking their secret sources in Moscow, they threw a blanket over it, according to Steele, because they were terrified of Trump, basically, knowing what a notoriously volatile guy he is. But they were also afraid that if they investigated him, this might jeopardize the sort of post-Brexit trade deal between the US and the UK. And Steele's allegation, if you like, is that they put party politics before British national security. And that's a pretty grave claim.
I want to just ask you about this referendum. Obviously, we now have a president in Russia who's going to be there potentially, if he chooses to be, till 2036, till he's 83 years old, I think. President Putin. What does it matter? First of all, for Russia, and a lot of people are saying it's stagnation, and it's probably not very good news.
Yeah, I mean, there are sort of two broad aspects of this. One is it's a disaster for Russia because Putin strikes me as tired, and I'm not even sure he necessarily wants to go on until he's 83. But essentially, it's a soft dictatorship, if you like. Real genuine political opposition was extinguished long ago, and he as of today is effectively kind of president for life. I mean, he's going to out Brezhnev and out Stalin. I think he doesn't out Ivan the Terrible. I think Ivan the Terrible did.
There's somebody that he doesn't outlast there. Thank you, Luke.
But the point is that it's going to be more of the same. It's going to be this kind of phony political landscape. It's going to be a deeply corrupt and often sort of brutally repressive regime. So that's not great for ordinary Russians.
And then for the West.
And for the West, it means that we're going to have more of these misadventures that we've seen in the US, UK, and across Europe over the next few years, because Putin and Putin's brain is still there. And as we discussed, he sees the West as the enemy and is doing everything in his power to undermine and subvert it. So we're going to get more exotic murders down the road. We're going to get more election interference, not just in November, but beyond. Clandestine support for far-right, xenophobic, populist parties, and more kind of social media stuff, which never really kind of let up. So it's a pretty depressing day for anyone who believes, if it's possible to still believe in democracy and transparency, and just in the idea that government should change, that it's a good thing that you change your leaders from time to time.
Yeah, I covered him in the year 2000 on the night where everybody thought the computers were going to crash on Y2K, as suddenly we had this surprise announcement by Boris Yeltsin. I cannot believe we're talking about it 20 years later. And we're going to be talking about President Putin for a long time. Luke Harding, great journalist, and the book Shadow State. I think if you don't know about President Putin, you will certainly know more about him after reading it. And I think it also it ties how it has affected the West, whether it be the United Kingdom or America. It's a great book. Thank you, Luke.
Thank you, Daniel. Really, real pleasure to talk to you. Thanks very much.